Happy New Year, everybody, and welcome to the next episode of our second series of Collectively Speaking. My name is Max Farrell. I'm the Chief Exec of the LDN Collective, and as you may or may not know, we are a group of people with different skill sets working in the built environment on projects with a social and environmental agenda. Today's episode is about probably the most important topic, which is how we can collectively try to address the impact of the built environment on the climate and reduce our carbon footprint. And one of our real standout projects that we've been working on throughout the year and launched earlier this year was around net zero neighbourhoods. And I'm delighted to have one of the key people involved in that here today, Hannah Jewkes from AESG. And Hannah acted as the sort of researcher and writer, and now very much the advocate for this piece of work, which hopefully will persuade decision makers to take on board more of these types of innovations within renewable energy, retrofit, and other innovations in that space. Hannah and I have been working together for a few years now, and particularly very intensive period where we worked on a research and advocacy around net zero neighbourhoods. It's been almost a year now since we launched it at MIPIM, and we're planning on circling back and doing a bit of a review and perhaps even thinking about the next edition later this year. Hannah, great to see you today.
Thank you very much for having me.
And really interested to hear a bit about your background and how did you get into sustainability? Was that something you always felt passionate about?
No, not particularly. So I started off doing civil and coastal engineering at university, which, I mean, it follows a similar thread, but was in a slightly different context. And the main reason I turned to sustainability was I was doing a diving course and told people what I was studying, and they told me I was killing the planet. And it was like this horrible moment of realization where I was like, well, that's not what I want to do. So I finished my bachelor's degree and said, I'm changing, that's it, and managed to make the move to sustainability for my master's. And since then, I've been absolutely loving it. I sort of started more in the business space, doing focus on ESG reporting and carbon reporting and those kind of things. And then in the past couple of years had made the change back to the sort of building roots from my original university course, focusing more on the built environment.
Wow, fantastic. And I think in many ways that's why when we first started talking about net zero neighbourhoods, it became such an interesting and sort of dynamic project, because we were looking at it from many different angles. And just for the benefit of any of the listeners, the project started when in discussions with Andrew Dakers, who's the chief exec of West London Business.
Yes.
And it was sort of born out of the fact that West London was facing a really severe crisis in terms of their energy supply and capacity. And it's something that not many people had foreseen happening, because it was one of those consequences of the increasing demand for data and the building of data centres in West London, because they need to be as close as possible to these big fibre optic cables. But what that then meant is that new housing or development projects were stalling because they couldn't guarantee access to electricity supply. Mm-hmm. So that's when Andrew said to me, do you have people within the LDN Collective that are familiar with innovation in low energy construction and development that doesn't put such a strain on the grid, but also looks at ways of sort of decentralizing energy supply and projects at the local level. And that's when we got together and thought, well, let's start looking for case studies, but also start to understand what are the things that they have in common in terms of the principles that these types of projects and initiatives it all share or embody.
Yeah.
Just one additional thing that was happening at the time was that 3CI, the Cities Commission for Climate Investment, were asking councils to bid for support in order to help fund projects like retrofitting at scale or solar panels, but they weren't really providing case studies and the ability to see how these things have worked elsewhere and what the outcomes were, which is when we spoke to them, they thought it would be very helpful to have that additional colour and context.
Yes.
So in terms of the principles that net zero neighbourhoods have or share, what was the sort of main lessons that you learned from looking across all those case studies?
The 3CI report was mostly really interesting because it was so in-depth and it was so challenging to understand as someone that even works within the industry. So I think something that we also wanted to add to this was something that people who aren't in the industry but have a passion for getting their home sustainable could have something to reflect on and look at, to have a baseline of something that they could then build upon, and just to get a bigger idea of what else is out there in terms of what they could do themselves to their homes to help make them more sustainable, reduce their costs in the future, all of those kind of things, to sort of just provide a simplified, holistic view, the very broken down basic steps that can be taken.
Yeah, because there's a lot of technical and financial information there, wasn't there, which unless you're sort of an expert in that field is difficult to get your head around. So,
exactly, and it's all incredibly useful, but it can often be overwhelming when you look at these things and just see so much information down on a page and you think, well, where do I even start with all of this? I think that was something that we wanted to try and fix and focus on, really, of providing that aspect.
So in terms of the things that they had in common that were really underpinning a lot of these projects, because they were very different, weren't they? What can you tell us about those sort of underlying principles?
Yeah, so across the 10 case studies that we have, we were able to sort of identify 10 key principles that we thought not necessarily every single case study had, but across the 10, these were the ones that sort of kept reoccurring. They can be grouped into different sections. So one of them is based upon the building itself. So things like the building fabric, making sure that we've got high insulative materials, low U values in the walls, trying to keep that heat in, looking at massing of the building to make sure that we're not letting loads of heat out of all of these extra walls that aren't required. Then moving on to technologies and things like renewable energy, energy storage, ground source heat pumps, air source heat pumps, other additions that can be added to your building to help reduce your energy costs. And then finally looking at the use of available data. So trying to ensure that you yourself could see, number one, where your energy is coming from, how your energy is being used, and then be able to track that.
Yeah, I mean there's been huge advances in that space, hasn't there, about how you can actually start to understand the impact that different measures that you take is having, whether that's insulation or renewable energy.
Yeah.
But the other interesting thing, I think, from my experience and working on this project was about the financial side and how these things are funded in the first place, because I think funders and investors tend to be quite conservative and look at the risks, and when it's all new types of technology, there's not a huge amount of data out there, which is partly I think why we did this project, was to instill more confidence in decision makers to actually do things differently, because at the same time as we're having this crisis around electricity supply in West London, there didn't seem to be much change in the way that house builders were still having the same sort of model and approach, without really thinking in a more sort of radical or design-led way. So, I think how things are funded, but also what the cost savings are after you've spent the initial capital expenditure is really important as well.
The sharing of that information.
And how that's shared and it's more open source.
It was really great for a lot of our case studies that we were able to find information that of all the good that they had been able to do and all of their energy savings. Every single one of our case studies has energy savings, but it was also really great to see that a lot of them were able to sort of say, this is where we went wrong. Don't copy us in this area, because they are trying new things and they don't always go right the first time. But to learn from that, we need to know about it. So it was also great to be able to include a lot of the lessons that they've learned, either in the funding side of things or in the actual technologies themselves, or even sort of in terms of their community engagement, where they think they could have done more. All of those things are really great to also look at and see how we can build upon that in the future.
Yeah, so one of the projects that has got a lot of interest since we published the report was in Barnsley, where the community had got together and had a really interesting and unprecedented almost approach to how they got the funding for it. And I think the story of that and how it then created more social cohesion and social impact is a really interesting one. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
So it was a group called the Community Energy Coalition that originally started getting together, and they had decided that they wanted to try and help the vulnerable homes in Barnsley. They started putting on solar panels across their roofs. In the industry, we often refer to it as PV for photovoltaic, but they all sort of refer to the same thing. They've started putting all of these across their roofs, mainly for a focus on heating. They found that a lot of their vulnerable homes just didn't have the money to be able to pay for their heating, and they really wanted to help them. So they got together and they managed to get a retail bond that was 5 years. I think it was a 5-year bond. And they were able to use that to start basically putting PV on people's houses. And they've done a really great job, again, of being able of recording and then showing off the information of where they did have large upfront costs of installing the PV, getting the PV on the houses and all of those kind of things, but then the energy savings that they've had afterwards. And now they're also starting to look at how they can also provide energy storage and all of these other things to just keep it growing in the community. But yeah, as you said, it was all community-led. That had nothing to do with the council or anything involvement. That was all just a group of people that really wanted to do something for the community, for each other, and get something sustainable and good going.
So when we first sort of embarked on this journey, I remember Andrew Dacres saying what we really need to find is an example of sort of high-density residential development that has a significant amount of affordable housing, but also extremely high standards of sustainability and environmental efficiency. And the holy grail was to find a sort of an affordable, high-density passive house scheme. And I think it took us a while, didn't it, to find one. But when we did, it was really exciting because Muse, the developer, had just finished a scheme in Manchester called Greenhouse, a bit of a riff on passive house, and it was 100% affordable and of passive house standards. So from what we learn as a case study, how can that help others have confidence that they can also do that even in today's difficult economic climate?
Starting off, passive house is a certification that any building can get. They do new build, retrofit, anywhere from residential to office. I think they started Passive House as residential, but you can do it in many other things. Started off in Germany, and it's a certification that very heavily focuses on the building fabric itself, ensuring that the structure you have around you is as sustainable as possible, so that then when you do the addition of the solar panels and anything like that, you're really able to reduce your energy to pretty much nothing. The whole certification uses things like triple glazed windows to really reduce U values, and it has very specific regulation on where windows can be to ensure that you're using the sun as much as possible to heat your home or to cool it in the summer if needed. So it's really interesting. But Greenhouse, I think it was 96 apartments in Manchester. I think it was the biggest in the north of England when it was done. I think it was January 2024, I think, building completed on it. So it's still quite new. I'm assuming it is still the biggest in the north at the moment. But it's really a great idea and a great starting place, because no matter what you do to that now, because that fabric of the building is already so sustainable and so energy efficient, no matter what you do to the rest of the building, it will always be sustainable. And what they also did really well there is leaving a lot of the apartment space open, as many people now are starting to work from home more. The layout of our houses and our living rooms and things like that is so much more important, so that people are able to find places for desks and workspaces and all of these kind of things that in previous homes weren't a consideration. But also making sure that if eventually working from home deteriorates and not as many people work from home anymore, you're not then left with a small space that you can't do anything else with because it was meant to be an office. It's all about these flexible working areas.
And so not all of the case studies were in England, and I know that one of them was in the suburbs of Dublin in Ireland. And that was very relevant for West London too, because it was about capturing, as I understand it, waste heat from data centres or waste energy, which presumably there's waste energy from all sorts of industrial or civic buildings that could be captured in that way, but it's not often planned from the outset or done retrospectively. So what did we find, and what were the lessons to be learnt from that particular scheme?
Really, when we started out, we were hoping to be able to find a data centre that had been attached onto retrofit housing that was already there. Unfortunately, we couldn't find one. We don't, as far as I'm aware, I don't think it's actually been done. So this has all been connected up to new build apartments and a few public buildings as well. But the reason why data centres are so great is because previously you would have to use energy to cool what is already being heated. We are now trying to remove all of that energy that is having to be pumped in to cool it, and instead taking the heat that's being generated. Not only are we helping the houses by heating them, we're also helping the data centre because they're no longer having to use as much energy in their cooling.
Brilliant. It's good to explain that, because I think a lot of people wouldn't necessarily understand how connected that is, and the sort of it's a real yin and yang thing, isn't it? So
I think that's actually quite common across quite a lot of the case studies as well, actually. Yeah. If you read through them, it's always positive on all parties involved. It's very rare that one party ends up having a negative effect, whether it's financial or energy use or something else, that everyone generally has a positive benefit.
So that strikes me as something that is incredibly useful for West London when the biggest issue is around data centres and the lack of energy for housing. So what do you think is sort of preventing those types of collaborations and partnerships from happening more often? Is it, a housing company that was very forward thinking about energy, or was it an energy company that had a existing partnership with housing? How did that work? Do you know?
It was originally introduced by the South Dublin County Council as they wanted to try and reduce their carbon emissions throughout the year. So as the data centre was being constructed, the council went to them and said, this is something we would like to look into, this is something we would like to pursue, and hence why it was then originally connected to a lot of the public buildings, and now they're starting to be able to introduce it to developers. So they're currently building 133 affordable apartments that will also be connected up to the district heating system.
Wow, very forward-thinking council. So it sounds to me like we should arrange a study trip and bring our colleagues from Ealing, Hillingdon and Hounslow along to see how that came about and what the impact was, because it sounds like a brilliant and very progressive approach.
Absolutely.
And kind of joined up thinking that you need, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good. So let's talk a bit about, I know there's another case study in Cornwall, which had some involvement from Lord Matthew Taylor, who we work with on some of our garden community projects. But he's also the chairman of a heat pump company called Kenza, who have been looking at heat pumps not in isolation for individual houses, but actually at the sort of street and neighbourhood scale, as I understand it. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so it's all quite new. At the moment, they've only done their sort of pilot project, but it connects, I believe it was around 160 homes with one ground source heat pump. The way it works is they go in and they install the ground source heat pump with no upfront costs to anyone that wants to be connected to it. And then there is a standard fee charge that then gets applied to use the heat source. So far from what they've got, the standard fee is always less than what they would be paying for their normal energy fees. So once again, there is a gain from the people using the ground source heat pump, and then Kenza also make a return on their investment of deploying the ground source heat pump.
Wow, fantastic. So does it take a certain period of time for that to then start to compare to the more traditional cost of energy, or is it cheaper from the outset for the consumer? Cheaper
from the outset. As soon as the energy starts to come from the ground source heat pump, that's it. However, I will just add, this is just heating, so it's not all energy. The ground source heat pump will only provide the heating, but living in the UK, that's quite a large proportion of most people's bills. So.
Definitely. And it just makes sense, doesn't it, in terms of, if you're going to pay for the hardware to do it to service a wider number of people, rather than having to do, put in a heat pump in every house.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, ground source heat pumps require quite a lot of construction to be able to get them in place. They require really deep boreholes that go straight down into the ground to be able to get that heat back up. So being able to do it on a larger scale for more homes means that the effect actually, in terms of having the construction on your street for however long it takes, is reduced, because you're only having to do it once to be able to serve a large amount of property.
And so those property residents presumably had to all get together and come up and mutually agree on doing it in the first place?
So I believe it was actually Kenza that reached out to the community rather than the other way around, just for this pilot project. So the ground source heat pump ended up serving 98 of the homes with really positive feedback. Kenza went back to them and did sort of like survey to see how well they'd done, and all of the feedback that came back was really positive. Everyone thought it was a really good idea.
Wow, sounds like there's another study trip to Cornwall.
Another study trip, yeah. Maybe in the summer.
So that's brilliant, and some really interesting case studies. And again, that report's available, isn't it, for anyone to to download and read more, including a lot of the sort of evidence and data to support that sort of findings. So it's interesting what's happened since we did the report, because we've now started working on a major project together, which is for a new community. It's west of Peterborough, and it's currently sort of low quality, low grade agricultural land, where the client is a group that owns a number of different green technology companies like biofuels and EV charging and retrofitting. The vision is to create a new community with 5,000 new homes of different mixes of tenures and homes that are affordable and for older people and for rent and for sale. But crucially, at the heart of it is a new employment hub called Eco Dynamo, which is bringing together a lot of those green companies and having links to the university. And in a way, it's what the garden communities were always supposed to be, which was a very holistic, sustainable places where you can live, work and play all within the town, as opposed to being dormitory or commuter towns, which quite often these sort of new housing developments are. So I've been working on the project for a while now. We've got Jazz Balla doing the master planning, and Tim Ashwin, who was on a previous podcast talking about the whole sort of economic or socio-economic strategy. But you've been brought in recently to develop a strategy for energy and sustainability, which when you first start to think about it is going to be hard, whatever we do, because we're building new, and alongside the homes and the employment district is a lot of infrastructure. And then there's issues around existing energy supply and impact on the grid and the difference between embodied carbon and operational carbon. So can you tell us a bit about what the strategy that you have developed and how that might act as a template for other sort of, this government is very keen on a whole raft of new towns. And what have you sort of proposed, and how might that be replicable?
Yeah, I mean, we're only in the beginning stages, so this is going to develop further. But I think a lot of the key principles that are being embedded at the moment are based around the forms of the building and orientation of the buildings, to ensure, once again, that we're making the most use out of the natural environment, things like the sun, to be able to heat our homes. The second is the connections to the town is also a really big focus, trying to concentrate on walking distances between the homes and the centres of towns to ensure that that would be a preferred option rather than trying to take a car. We've also been looking into ensuring that all houses have EV charging, all houses have PV and their own source of electricity to try and alleviate that stress on the grid that we're currently facing. And another big thing as well, as you mentioned, is the Eco Dynamo. So trying to ensure that there's not only the community engagement at the beginning while the project is being designed, but also throughout the village's creation and then operation, so that people, number one, can ensure they have an understanding of why the village is the way it is and why it's been set up the way it has, and also how to use the buildings properly. A lot of sustainability is designed in ways that a lot of people don't realise. Things like, when it's too hot, actually often keeping your windows closed in a sustainably designed building will cool the building quicker than leaving them open. And it's little things like this where, when we have that community engagement and these things are spoken about, that understanding is there for the homeowners themselves. It was mainly focused on energy at the moment. However, in the future, we're definitely going to be looking into things like the rainwater harvesting, especially as it is a garden community, being able to save that water and then use it to water the plants during areas of no rain, although we're in the UK. Rare, but yeah, it's definitely something we're going to look into. Water efficient equipment, of course, all throughout the buildings and the houses and all of those kind of things, low flow rates.
Given the sort of timescales that we're looking at for Sibson, it's not yet within the local plan, so we're quite a few years off getting planning consent. Even regulations are changing all the time, aren't they?
Yes.
And I know that we have imminently the higher standard for Future Homes Plus, I believe it's called. Can you tell us a bit more about that and how sort of Sibson is already preparing to meet those high standards?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's quite a big step up from our current Part L regulations, with a really heavy look at PV being number one. All new houses need to have PV and EV, electric vehicle charging, within them. So that's something that's being implemented. And then they're also really toughening up on the U values that are being used in the walls. So the building fabric, going back to those basic building principles, making sure that the fabric is there first, which I think is really important as this is new build. Something really important to get right first time. So we're really looking at low U value materials and good insulation, and also at the minimum double glazing windows, probably triple, to try and ensure that we can keep all of that heat in.
Well, we've heard some really amazing case studies where we've been able to go and actually see and understand the impact that certain projects and innovations have had. But we also looked at things that are in train that are coming down the track, as it were, and things to look forward to in the future where we're really pushing the boundaries of these types of interventions. There's a section in the report called Future Gazing, Learning from the Past, Looking to the Future. What would you say if you were to draw out just a one or two things for the listeners to really be aware of and look out for that could have a big radical effect in the future? What would you say those might be?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of my favourites that I found while doing the research was using the waste heat from the underground. As a Londoner myself, I know that the heat on the underground can sometimes be unbearable. So being able to reuse that heat to heat our homes in the winter is a really great initiative. They're really making strides with it as well. I don't think they've actually yet heated a home with it, but they're definitely starting to put the infrastructure in place to be able to get there in the future. And Octopus are also doing some really interesting initiatives. They already have some great ones to help people start implementing solar panels and stuff like that onto their homes, helping them see the energy savings. But they also do different tariffs for industry and larger buildings, warehouses, things like that, where if they produce over the amount of energy through renewable sources that they use, Octopus will then help distribute that renewable energy to again alleviate the grid and ensure that all of this renewable energy that we're producing isn't going to waste.
I mean, that is exciting when an energy company is doing their best to stop you from paying energy bills. Is amazing. And we're working or hoping to have a partnership with Octopus on the modular housing that we've been working on with Waits, which is aiming to get people out of temporary accommodation and into more suitable family homes, but with Octopus, the idea I think is that if you pay for the solar panels when the modules are being constructed, that they will then guarantee something like 10 years of no bills, which when you're a cash-strapped local authority or council tenant is a massive thing. Well, Hannah, really exciting that we've been able to take the things we've learned from those case studies and apply them to real life projects like Sibson and some others that are now emerging, and I'm really looking forward to collaborating with you and the team at AESG on those. And so I suppose to draw that to a conclusion, and also a recommendation for anyone that hasn't read the report to look that up. It's on LDN Collective website, but also AESG and West London Business. And as Hannah was saying, if you have any questions or you're interested in this field, then please do get in touch with Hannah, and I'm sure you'd be very happy to speak to people or respond to any requests for more information.
Yes, absolutely. Please do.
Great stuff. Well, so that was our episode on net zero neighbourhoods, and the first of 2025, and looking forward to many more interesting topics and themes as in the year ahead.